had fed back to me states about the lack of tea bags, so noted. And okay, so apparently there's no tea bags. But what's this noise going on? Is it from within the shul or?
No, it's someone's phone.
Okay. Okay. So I was looking through my list of topics that people have nominated, and someone wrote to me asking me to cover. Oh goodness, it's going again. Okay. Yeah. Do you want to just maybe just ask him? Sorry. All else being equal, it was being there acting. Okay, so I was looking through my list of topics, and one of those that sprung out, which is sort of a mid-sized topic, and therefore I thought appropriate till just to get us through for the next few weeks till the December break, was that of predestination, the balance between human control over our affairs and that which is predestined, which ties into concepts around bechira and free will, and Mazal. Which is Mazal is the closest word we have, I suppose, to fate or luck or destiny. So I thought I'd sort of touch on these topics, and I was looking through my notes, and to the best of my ability, to the best of my recollection, as far as I can see, even though we've touched on bechira from psychological aspects, I don't think we've ever spoken about free will from the theological or philosophical angle. So I thought that we could do this as our topic, our next topic. That's okay with me. Particularly because the title of the series officially is Life's Big Questions, and even though we spent some time speaking about the status of the Hebrew language or Zionism, it's difficult to call those always life's big questions. So this is one of life's big questions. So let's just spend a little bit of time trying to explore it. So I think there's, as I said, really four components to this. The first three revolve around free will, and then the fourth revolves around predestination in and of itself. So I'll just try and use the next few weeks to pick them up one by one. So the concept of free will, in a moment, I will discuss what a central concept it is to Jewish thinking, but it's also a profoundly problematic concept. People often speak about the theological problems with free will, and how this fits God's control of the world, or God's foreknowledge. But the truth is there's psychological and philosophical problems with free will, and also, by the way, interesting developing scientific research on the matter. And for people that read up about these things, there's questions developing there also. It's in its infancy, that area, so I'll only touch upon it and give some preliminary thoughts. But I thought that those are the issues that make sense to work through. So just, I suppose, to remind ourselves, Judaism seems very firmly committed to the concept of bechira. It's arguably the foundation of all foundations. It's interesting, by the way, it's not listed by the Rambam in his 13 principles of faith, and yet it seems to be a preliminary, in essence, to many of them, if not all of them. It's difficult to conceive of the Torah as a set of instructions, which is perhaps the definition of Torah, or at least a significant component of what Torah is. It's difficult to conceive of the Torah as a set of instructions if we humans are not free to then choose whether to follow them or not. So if our behavior and our actions are not in our, and thoughts and emotions are not in our control, it's difficult to conceive of what Torah would mean. The Torah, in addition, speaks about consequences to decisions, and it's difficult to understand the moral justice of rewards and punishments, whatever rewards and punishments exactly mean. We just speak about Olam Haba and so on, but whatever they exactly mean, it's difficult to conceive of rewards and punishments in a world in which free will doesn't exist. And more than that, there's psukim that seem explicitly to dictate free will. Or b'charta b'chaim, you should choose life. You should choose between you should choose between good and evil. You should choose between bracha, blessing, and klala, curse. So the Torah does seem to, again and again in its language, speak about choice. Now, I'm not saying all these questions are unanswerable if you reject free will. I'm simply saying it does seem to be a basic premise. Within the 13 principles of faith of the Rambam, and again, a while back, we had a sort of fairly long share exploring these principles of faith, and to what degree there's debate and discussion around them. But many of these ideas are touched upon in the principles of faith, even if it doesn't explicitly mention the concept of Bechira. By the way, in his Mishnah Torah, in the halachic work of the Rambam, the principles of faith, you'll often hear that the Rambam's principles of faith don't appear in his halachic work, they only appear in his commentary to the Mishnah. And that's true in the sense that the sort of formulaic list of them as 13 principles of faith only appears in the commentary to the Mishnah. However, it's not true in the sense that the Rambam does very clearly paskin the 13 principles of faith. He just doesn't lay them out in that sort of systematic list in that way for some reason or other. And the place where he brings them is in Hilchos Teshuvah, in the laws of repentance. Teshuvah is the classic example of the concept of free will. I mean, it's predicated both on moral responsibility, otherwise you wouldn't need to repent, and the possibility of repentance is built around the idea of free will. The Rambam discusses in his Mishnah Torah Bechira at length, and he does this in again in his Hilchos Teshuvah. Unsurprisingly, that's the place where you would want to talk about free will. And the Rambam there again seems to be in line with all classic thinkers, really, that consider free will to be actually an absolute basis and premise of the rest of Judaism's ability to function and deliver the message that it wants to deliver. So free will seems to be really elementary and fundamental to Yiddishkeit. Perhaps, as I said, it emerges from many of the 13 principles of faith, including the idea of reward and punishment, including the idea of Hashem having a relationship with us, including the idea of tefillah and service of God, so many of them. And perhaps, paradoxically, because it was so fundamental, it's not listed as one of the 13 principles of faith, because the Rambam almost didn't see it as a principle of faith. He just saw it as almost axiomatic to everything else, and therefore, in a sense, it precedes the principles of faith. With the Rambam, nothing is coincidental in how he lays things out, and he thought very carefully about how he laid things out. And it may be that, as I said, underlying the 13 principles of faith may be a sort of a premise that precedes them, which is the concept of free will. Either way, there hasn't been much debate in Jewish thought around our belief in free will. And I think I said a while back that, to the best of my knowledge, there's really only been two Jewish thinkers in the whole of, but two significant thinkers, and others, two thinkers who have been preserved for all time, who have entered the canon of great Jewish thinkers who have questioned free will as a premise of Judaism. There may have been many other individual Jews who wondered about it, but thinkers who have bothered writing books on the matter, and whose books have been widely read. There's really only two thinkers that drift away from seeing free will as a basic premise. One in the era of the Rishonim, one of the Spanish philosophers in the 1300s, and in more recent times, one of the great Hasidic rabbis, the Meha Shloach, the Rebbe of Izbich, who was a very influential Hasidic leader, and the Rebbe of people like Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen, very important Hasidic figures. And he himself seems to have played with the idea of determinism or lack of human free will. How far he took it and exactly what he meant is difficult. But the reason basically why there's been so few Jewish thinkers who have ever put this forward, two out of hundreds that are studied and learnt, is because it's almost an untenable position to adopt in Jewish thinking. So I'm going to go in line with not just the majority view, not just even the consensus view, the near universal Jewish view that Bechira is an axiom, it's a premise. And with that sort of introduction in mind, we'll try and explore what exactly it means. So there are really three levels of discussion that need to be had around Bechira. The first is psychological, as I said, the second is philosophical, or philosophical stroke scientific, and the third is theological. So just taking them one by one, let's talk about the psychological problems with Bechira. So this is something that we discussed right at the beginning of me starting this series, when I think we were looking at Rav Dessler's thinking. So I'll just, I don't know how many of you were there at the time, but I'll remind you of that discussion because it's very important. There are psychological problems with free will. And the basis of the psychological problems is that the truth is, if we're honest, a lot of how we behave seems to be controlled by our environment, by our genes, by our upbringing, nature and nurture. For our purposes, it doesn't really matter which, but some combination of the two. It doesn't seem to be true that we genuinely make free decisions. If we're honest with ourselves, the reasons we have the values we have, the reasons to a degree that we have the faith we have, the reasons to a degree that we're in fields of job and career that we have are very much molded by our environment. I mean, that seems very clear and obvious, and by our families and by our communities and the like. It doesn't seem, thank you very much, it doesn't seem at all clear or yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, it's a double hit now. Charles, maybe you were right not to have coffee. Maybe. Okay. It doesn't seem at all. It doesn't seem at all obvious that that we genuinely have free will. Should I just give everyone a moment just to mop up? Or... So I'll just wait 41 minutes. Yes, not Milchemes Hashem, the Milchemes Hashem. I didn't mention his name because I blanked as I was speaking. I'll come back to me in a minute.
He recognised as a go-on.
Yeah, and everywhere. University was one of the premier thinkers. Sorry, apologies for those of you who are online. We're just a little bit of a mini crisis here with several coffee cups being spilled. No. Ah, wonderful. Okay. Okay, I hope we're being recorded. Okay. So again, let's just focus. I think maybe okay. No more bringing in, please. Yeah, sorry. Excuse me. No more bringing in anything. It's too. Thank you. Sorry. Apologies. Thank you. Yeah. Psychological, yes. So there seems to be psychological problems with the concept of bechira. Oh goodness, these interruptions. Yes. It doesn't seem to be true. It doesn't seem to be correct that that we have a genuinely free will. We seem to be heavily influenced by our environment, by our family, by nurture, by nature. Is it really true psychologically that we have free will? And this is something that's most fully addressed by Rav Dessler, a fairly recent thinker. Rav Dessler flourished before the war, a product of the East European Muslim movement. Before the war, he ran away to England, to the UK, where he was very influential in setting up several of the gated institutions. After the war, moved to Israel and ended up his career as the mashgiach in the developing Ponevezh yeshiva, a very important recent thinker. And amazingly, really, he's the first to have formulated a sort of coherent and systematic discussion around this point. So yes.
God knows our circumstance. So the way around the future.
Yeah,
it's different depending on those
So
circumstances.
I'll share Rav Dessler's thoughts on this matter. So Rav Dessler is the first, as I said, I think the first thinker who systematically deals with this issue. And he simply says that our adherence to the concept of bechira doesn't mean that we're claiming we have a full range of free will. It means, as you referenced, the concept of nekutat bechira, it means we have a point of free will. That's all that the claim of bechira means. We don't have, for all sorts of physical and psychological reasons, a complete range of free will. On the physical realm, there's clearly actions we can't choose to do. We can't choose to flap our arms very fast and fly, or more realistically, I guess most of us in this room, perhaps all of us in this room, couldn't have chosen to become gold medalist Olympic athletes because we simply don't have the ability to do it. We don't have the right genes, the right ability to do this. There's limits to what we can choose to do. We couldn't have chosen to become Beethovens or Einsteins. There's a limit to our range of abilities, and therefore there's choices that are out of our physical or intellectual or ability to choose. And similarly, there's choices that's out of our psychological range. He says even in the realm of halacha or mitzvahs or moral decisions, there's a limit to our range of free will. Probably psychologically, most of us couldn't choose to murder someone. It's just simply not within our psychological capacity because we've been raised with psychological hang-ups and inhibitions, you might call them, or you might call them moral commitments that don't allow us the possibility of doing it.
I think that's a very sweeping generalization, because I think all of us probably have the potential to do it. But we're just living in this very comfortable life where we're not presented with it. But if it's a matter of our survival,
I'm not arguing whether in theory we could think up a case study. I'm just saying in our day-to-day life, it's not within the realm of Anakutas Bechira. That's what I mean. In other words, I'm avoiding the issues of what's internal and what's external. I'm saying in normal life, it's just simply not a choice we face realistically. So, and by the way, this is, I'll come in a moment to his thoughts around the shifting, the Kutas Bechira, but presumably this also applies in terms of an upper limit. Perhaps none of us could sacrifice everything we have to go off and volunteer in the slums of India or in Africa. There's probably limits to our philanthropic possibility, our charitable possibility, our volunteering possibilities on the one hand, and on the other hand, limits to our ability to choose evil also. Again, there could be extreme circumstances, but they're pushed just beyond that. But in realistic life, this isn't a Bechira that we face. We don't really have free will around that idea, at least as we currently are. So this is the first point that Tesla makes, and I think quite an intuitive point. The second point he makes is that our Nekudat Bechira can shift over time. So if we consistently make good moral decisions, we could find ourselves eventually able to make moral choices that perhaps were initially beyond our moral capacity. Or if we consistently make awful moral decisions, we can find ourselves eventually able to make moral decisions that were formerly out of our moral capacity. And the analogy he uses for this was his metaphor as a thinker who really flourished, came to his prime between the world wars, was the analogy of the trench warfare in the First World War, in which you have a very narrow band of battle. So you may have 150 meters of hell on earth, really, this full of mustard gas and barbed wire and marshlands and shooting and so on between the two trenches of the opposing sides. And within that very narrow range, a fierce battle rages. But on one side of the trench, you have the French peasants calmly going about their life, tending their vineyards or doing whatever French peasants do. And on the other side, you have the German farmers calmly eating sauerkraut, or whatever German peasants do. And there's peace reigns. And in the middle, you've got this horrible battle line of confrontation. So that's the Nekudas Bechira, that we have a very small band, relatively small bands of tension as to how we choose to behave. But most of our life, actually, we live in peace. We don't even reflect upon or consider, or it's not really within the range of options that we can meaningfully consider and maybe even psychologically can bring ourselves to do under normal circumstances. Having said that, over time, the trenches can shift. So you could come back a year later and find that where was previously at peace within Germany, now that's the battlefront. And where previously the battlefront existed, now is at peace because the trench has shifted up. The two trenches have shifted up a mile down the road over a year of fighting, whatever may have occurred. So this is the analogy he uses for the sort of psychological shifting that can occur. So over time, I can move myself up or down within the range or the realm of free will. This is known, by the way. I mean, this is the stuff of fact and of fiction, but this is well known in many fields. So in criminal gangs and mafia and so on, they are aware that psychologically you can't often bring someone who wants to be a part of the gang and the criminal gang straight to being a murderer, and they'll have initiation processes which gradually ease them into psychological comfort to do these things. Otherwise, they simply couldn't bring themselves to pull the trigger. I just came back from Poland, and I'm always wary of analogies from the Holocaust, and so on has to be careful. But again, it's well known that at the beginning of the war, Germany faced, and throughout the war in different ways, faced psychological problems amongst even the most inhumane and barbaric of murderers in terms of their ability to carry out mass murder. And they had to put in place techniques to gradually ease people into this sort of practice also. So in the realm of both good and evil, people develop over time and move over the periods of their lives. What Rav Dessler says, based on this, just to sort of think through the moral implications of this, is a number of things. The first is a well-known idea. It's not unique to Rav Dessler in any sense at all. But he simply says that where I find my Nekudas Bechira, where I find the battle line ranging, is dependent on a number of factors out of my control. As you said, circumstances Hashem gave me, but in our terms, we can express them as the world within which I've been born, the family within which I was born, my psychological and moral makeup and the like, and that will affect where the Nekudas Bechira lies. And responsibility in life is how much you shift it rather than the absolute position that it's in. So someone can be born in a very rough and tough and perhaps morally poor environment, and if we choose to give numbers to these things on the ladder of moral behavior, maybe this person is born at a 15 on the moral scale. Obviously, it's ridiculous to determine these numbers, but just for as a thought experiment, and maybe throughout their life they work very hard morally and move themselves up to a 30. So they've grown 15 steps of the ladder, and maybe someone else is born on a moral level of 70 and moves up to 75 over the course of their life. So they end up far higher than the other person did, or maybe they move down 5 over the course of their life and end up as a 65. On an objective scale, they are far more moral figure than the first person, who's only on a 23. But on a life development scale, one has moved up 15 rungs of the ladder, and the other one has moved down 5 rungs of the ladder. So responsibility is how you shift yourself over life, rather than an absolute level you find yourself. And Rav Dessler gives an example, and I'll adapt his example to a real life case that I know of someone who grew up in very, very difficult circumstances, and growing up from being, I think I've shared this before, growing up from being at a very young age, a child sleeping rough on the streets, has developed themselves into a very fine and moral and good person. And they once told me that in their teens they survived by mugging elderly ladies. That's what they did. They grabbed money off them and their handbags and purses off them and so on. And this person told me that they used to be careful as they mugged them. They would lower them gently to the ground rather than shoving them over. So this is very, very interesting, because it really brings home Rav Dessler's point that you can have someone who's by any measure behaving in a thoroughly immoral way, yet within that is making moral decisions. So it's not I hope none of us would hold a badge of pride in the fact that when we steal off people, mug people, we try to do so in a gentle manner. But for this individual, that was a moral decision. So they were moving on step 15 to step 16 or step 17 because they were trying to do terrible behavior in the most under the circumstances, a morally good way. And probably as a result of things like this, because this person in my mind is an incredible human being and a hero of mine, this person now has ended up actually at a very decent life. They are in stable relationships with stable livelihoods now. They've educated themselves. They're exceptionally moral people who have actually faced very, very high moral dilemmas in over the years and have passed them with outstanding flying colours. In fact, this is an individual who starts off maybe at a 15 and has moved to a 70 in my mind. I mean, this is a phenomenal growth curve, but it started because of at a very young age this person thought through and realized and made moral decisions from a very low starting point. So this is Rav Dessler's thesis. Number one, that we have a narrow range of free will. We don't think that the concept of bechira, free will, means we can choose anything. Number two, moral responsibility is how we shift within that narrow range. And number three, it can change over time. So are you morally, is a person who, I don't know, starts off life at a poor moral base responsible for not achieving a higher moral level? Can they argue this is outside my range of free will? Maybe yes, maybe not. Maybe it's outside their current range of free will and therefore they're morally not responsible for this. Or maybe had they made good moral decisions by the time they ended their life, 50 years on, maybe they could have upped their moral scale and this could have been within the range of their free will. There are indications, by the way, of these ideas in earlier figures. The Vilna Gaon comments in the Mishnah in Ovis that talks about all of us undergoing a din, a court case, a judgment case in the Beis Din Shalmala, in the heavenly court after our death. And the language of the Mishnah is it talks about din v'cheshbon. There's a din, a trial, and a cheshbon, a calculation. Vilna Gaon really says an analogous idea to the one that we just spoke about. He says a din is where you were, the decisions you made. A cheshbon is where you could have been had you consistently made good decisions, which would have upped your level of halachic and moral and spiritual sensitivity and the like. So I could argue at the end of my life, look, I was never going to be a Chafetz Chaim, I was never going to be a Rabbi Zobin, I was never going to be someone of such outstanding virtue. And I may indeed be correct that was outside my range of moral choices, but I might be incorrect that it didn't have to be outside the range of moral choices, because had I consistently moved myself forward, maybe this could have ended up within my range of moral choices. This is the idea of Din Cheshbon.
This youngster, parents were very sparing. They thought he should be a shoemaker.
Yes.
He said that I encouraged him.
Yes.
When I got to heaven and said, where is I make that part? Where am I?
Yes, yes, a very beautiful story of the Netziv. Yes, as you say, in which he had he ended up as a shoemaker, he would have probably been a very moral and ethical and honest practitioner of that craft. But would have never dreamt that actually he had missed out a lifetime's achievement as probably the preeminent Rosh Hashiva, by the way, of certainly of his era and perhaps of all time. I mean, he was the one that brought the mother of all yeshivas, the Volozhin, into its prime and so on. So absolutely. So yeah. So the idea of Nekudas HaBechira isn't a get out of jail free card, but it does bring home to us the idea that the belief in Bechira, the commitment to Bechira that Yiddishkeit adopts, it doesn't mean that we believe in unfettered Bechira. Interestingly, by the way, the Rambam seems to disagree with this theory. And I'm not, I haven't read all the classic works on the subject, but to the best of my understanding, the Rav Dessler is the earliest source that sort of lays this out as a systematic explanation. The Rambam in several places seems to speak about free will, human free will, as unfettered, as almost limitless, or perhaps limitless. Maybe coming from your idea that under unique circumstances, things can be stretched to the limit. So I don't know if the Rambam means in every circumstance, or in theory, we could imagine circumstances that would stretch people to the limit. In others, or the Rambam disagrees with this psychological fact and maybe sees decisions as becoming ever weightier and ever more difficult, but with a heroic leap, I could indeed make a morally awful decision or a morally great decision. So maybe the Rambam is saying I could bring myself to do that act of murder if I really worked hard at it, and doesn't agree with this concept that there's a sort of a bandwidth, a limit to how far I can stretch myself. So that's the first point I would say, that the Rambam seems ostensibly to disagree with Rav Dessler around this point. The second point is that the Rambam, perhaps as a result, perhaps linked to this, is very bothered by the famous episodes of Paro losing his free will, I'll harden his heart. And the Rambam's writing is very moving and profound on the subject, really, because the Rambam accepts the psukim that on face value, that Paro's free will was indeed taken away from him. And he sees this as a punishment for Paro's terrible moral failures. And he sees this as the most devastating punishment imaginable, and almost the most miraculous thing imaginable. The greatest intervention you can imagine in human affairs is the drastic and shocking step of free will being lost from a human being. So it's such a catastrophic failure of what it means to be a human, such a catastrophic destruction of what it means to be a human being, that Rambam considers this like almost a one-off sui generis, like a completely exceptional circumstance. The idea that a Paro could have lost his free will due to as a punishment for the decisions he made, this was just shocking in the thought of the Rambam. So yes.
There was a therapist called Viktor Frankl,
yes,
who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, and he was in the camps. And he's in that place in the camps, there was no free will. And the only way that he felt that he could exercise any free will at all during the day was he'd decide in the morning which foot to get out of bed with. Sometimes he'd get out with his left, sometimes he'd get out with his right, in order that he felt that he still had some choice and some free will.
So there are circumstances where free will is restricted, where the band of Nekudas Bechira is very, very limited. But one of the things he writes very meaningfully in the book is that even in places where ostensibly free will is shattered and taken away, that there are elements of free will that remain in how I choose to respond to the situation, how within my own internal thinking. So your point is valid. We shouldn't just think of free will as actions, because there are circumstances, there are people even today who are in situations of extreme paralysis or the like, who have no choice over actions, but at least in principle have choice over perception and in a state. Again, I don't want to be. I'm always conscious when I'm talking about these things. It's quite easy to sit here in a state of thank God good health and a comfortable environment in Northwest London and make over-sweeping generalizations. And I'm conscious there are people that, due to events within their internal life and their own states of mental health and well-being, even the areas of response and reaction can sometimes be very restricted. So I don't even want to commit myself to a philosophical, or theological, or psychological position of which I have no knowledge or insight, and maybe no one has, as to what the extent of free will is in every case. But certainly in the realm of what we would consider regular, healthy life, we're committed to the concept of free will. And as I said, the Rambam disagrees with the Dessler's thesis to the best of my understanding, and is committed to an even broader range of free will. The third consequence of this is Obviously, this is dangerous. This can be a bit of a slippery slope because it's quite easy to pat ourselves on the back and sort of reassure ourselves, well, this particular area of halacha, this particular practice, is probably beyond my bechira, so I don't need to worry about it. It's not something I need to take responsibility. There's no intention in any of this to remove responsibility for two reasons. One is because the truth is, if we're considering it, it probably indicates it is within our. None of us are clapping al khayt or beating ourselves up for not being chafetz haims or Rabbi Zobin, or for not dropping everything and volunteering in Africa, or whatever your example you wish to choose of incredible moral heroism is. Almost by definition, as soon as one is feeling a bit guilty about not doing something and needing to justify it as well, maybe it's beyond my bechira, it may be an indication that at least potentially it isn't. Number one, and number two, as I said, we do have a responsibility to shift our range of free will up. So obviously none of us can move from 0 to 60 in 0 seconds. There is inertia built into the nature of the universe, and therefore we can't improve our spiritual or moral or halachic practice instantly overnight. But we can embark on a journey in which we sort of gradually improve. So this is not meant to be a get out of jail. It's not meant to be a free pass to saying none of maybe I don't have bechira about this. The final implication of this, which the Rambam actually spells out, is this means that ultimately we can't make any moral judgments about another human being, and this is very, very important, really essential. The Rambam writes about this in Perek Gimel of Hilchos Teshuvah, that only the Kel Deus, only the God of minds, that's how he translates the term Kel Deus, not Deus Daled Ayin Vav Tav Kel Deot, not the God of minds is how he translates it. Only Hashem, who knows ultimately every human being, can make the ultimate judgment about someone's moral worth. We have rules and laws and guidance as to how we need to interact with people. Clearly, it makes sense for us to choose as a role model someone who is an exemplar of moral and spiritual goodness. This is the concept of the idea of a gadol, of a great person who we look up as a role model to and see as a spiritual example. And clearly, we're not going to pick as our role model the addict sleeping rough on the sleep who has achieved nothing with their lives and perhaps indeed chooses to mug people in order to make their livelihood. That's not going to be a role model for us. And that's in terms of how we need to respond, how we need to behave. But the truth is, says the Rambam, in the ideas of Hashem, we have no idea who's the better person and who's the worst person. We've got no ability to crunch the numbers and know about that because of this. We don't really understand enough about people's circumstances and inner workings to make any moral judgments of the person. And the Rambam brings he alludes to various stories, both from Nach itself and from Medrash and from the Gemara, in which great people, Gedolei Olam, lie on their deathbeds and they say, I don't know where I'm heading, whether I'm heading to Rabbi Yechon, whether I'm heading to Gan Eden or to Gehinnom, I don't know what my moral state is. Figures that are held up as canonical. The most extreme example is Shmuel Hanavi. So clearly he is trusted and recognized as a canonical figure. His nevuah is part of Tanakh. That's in terms of our relationship to him. But he himself says, I don't know when it comes to the Yom Adin HaGadol, when it comes to the day of great justice, the day of great reckoning, when everything is taken into account, I don't know how I will fare. Let me say, in terms of his own internal sense of self, he says, I don't know, it's true I am, on the ladder, I am at 99 to 100. Shmuel equated by the Psukim, by David HaMelech to the equal or on par with Moshe and Aaron. So a figure of towering spiritual proportion from our perception, but from his own internal dynamic. When he needs to face his maker, he says, I don't really have a way of knowing, given all the opportunities I had. Shmuel was consciously better, right? He was promised by his mother and moved to live with Ada Cohen in the Beis HaMikdash from age 3. From my opportunities, from my life as the daughter of Chana and Elkanah and so on, I don't know how to grade my own achievements. I don't know how to grade where I am, and I don't know how God will grade me. So this is the concept of only the Chaldeus really knows how to judge someone. We have within Judaism, we have a legal system, and we have a punishment system, we have a court system. Again, the role of the courts is because they have to operate based on our human perception. This isn't a call to for moral for sort of postmodern skepticism around any ability to say anything about truth or morality. It's simply a reflection that when it comes to the subjective, when it comes to an individual human being, we don't really have a way of knowing the absolute moral content of their lives. So this is the psychological component, I think, that needs to be said about bechira, which is the commitment to bechira at least according to Rav Dessler, and one that seems intuitive, doesn't mean that we have a commitment to a complete free range of Bechira, free, wide open. It means there's a range of Bechira, how wide it is, under what circumstances could trigger extreme reactions, who knows? But in principle, we're okay with the idea that there's a limit to Bechira, and therefore it does mean that ultimately we don't really know how much of our own successes we can take the credit for, how much of our own failures we bear responsibility for. We have to operate on a system in which we take ownership of our actions and our choices, but in truth, we can't make any judgments of others, or by the way of ourselves. When I said that only the Chaldeus knows our own status, I don't just mean that that's the way of avoiding judgments of others, but it's also a way of avoiding judgments of ourselves. And this seems to be a reasonable model, even though there are some indications that the Rambam might have disagreed with this thought path. So that's the psychological, I think, element of discussion around Bechira. Let's move on then to the. Sorry, any thoughts or questions or comments about this before I move on to the next?
Yeah, I was just thinking in that story I think I was told, wasn't it he heard his parents speaking? That's what
Yes.
happened so much. Even that, it wasn't his own.
No.
It was to a degree his own way of dealing with it, but what would have happened if he hadn't heard?
Again, I don't know the details of the story, but the way the story is quoted is that in those days, I mean, a child being sent to school or cheder was not obvious at all. And at very young ages, they used to be apprenticed. I think one version of the story has him as a 9-year-old, which his parents are talking about removing him from cheder because he wasn't a particularly good student, and apprenticing him to the shoemaker. And he happened to be wasn't able to sleep that night. Or was one of these kids who enjoyed listening outdoors to his parents' conversations, and he burst into the room and begged for another chance. And that was really a pivotal moment in his life. It's interesting, by the way, again.
I was going to say, you could say Kodesh who did that, got his credit. I mean,
Possibly, yeah, but it's still a good analogy for the idea that there's a pivotal, whatever the historicity and details of the story are, it brings to the fore the idea that that there can be pivotal moments in which small choices can lead to wildly differing paths. I mean, I don't know if I should say this or not. the Briskers who have the ability to say to have sharp tongues in their mouths on occasion. So the line the Netziv said, and of course he was an ancestor of the Brisker dynasty, because Reb Chaim Soloveitchik's wife was a granddaughter of Netziv. The line that Netziv said was that one day he would get to heaven, where Hashem would say to him, "Shoemaker, shoemaker, where are your Sforim?" And one of the Brisker Rosh Hashivas said he wonders sometimes if there won't be Rosh Hashivas who arrive in heaven, and God says to them, Rosh Hashiva, where are your shoes? That's, in other words, it can jump both ways. I mean, there's nothing wrong with being a shoemaker if that's where you are meant to be, and there's nothing wrong with being a Rosh Hashiva if that's where you're meant to be. It's simply you have to make sure that you're making the correct choices in life, and it can cut both ways. Anyway, that's the way they took the story. Well, what is a fact, by the way, and I say this with some trepidation, there's probably no figure since the Vilna Gaon who wrote as wide-rangingly as the Netziv. The extent of his authorship over every area of Torah is truly outstanding, and there's no figure, again, in recent history of whom we are closely aware, who, as far as we can tell, was not a natural Eloi or genius, to the extent that is the case with Netziv. And he was clearly a clever and talented individual, but from what we know of him and his history, he was not the classic genius and Eloi. We do not have stories about Netziv, and maybe this story is reflecting that and some version of that, I don't know. But we do not have stories around the Netziv of sparkling and dazzling genius. There were great figures in our history who were very clearly geniuses. Chaim Brisker was clearly a genius. Vilna Gaon was clearly a genius. Rabbi Kireger was clearly just a brilliant mind. As far as we understand from Netziv's life, he was not a dazzling and sparkling genius. He was someone who got there by sheer hard work. And it's interesting that, again, as I said, to the best of my knowledge, since the Vilna Gaon and on, there hasn't been anyone who wrote as widely and as broadly as the Netziv. His output, given that he was a Rosh Hashiva, by the way, and therefore responsible for the Volozhin Yeshiva and for Talmidim, and for enormous fundraising commitments, even that aside, the range of his output and the number of incredible and beautiful Sforim that he wrote is just staggering. I don't know anyone who wrote as widely as the Netziv on so much varied work. It's just phenomenal. And it's very interesting that he was not a genius. I mean, he was, and again, maybe that's what the story is reflecting. That Therese just didn't see him as cut out for. He was the second son-in-law of Rabbi Yitzchak of Volozhin, the son of Rabbi Chaim Volozhin, and he was the disappointing son-in-law. No one saw him as destined for Rosh Hashiva status. No one saw him as reaching the peak of the leadership, and yet he was the Rosh Hashiva of the whole of Eastern Europe. He was the Rosh Hashiva of the next generation of Klal Yisrael's teachers and so on. So he is really the outstanding figure of where sheer hard work. He clearly was a talented person, but certainly not someone about whom anyone ever said any Eloi stories. There's no stories of Gaonis and genius around him at all. So yeah, absolutely.
And it's embarrassing for all of us.
Look, again, whether all of us could be Sivs or not, he was. I think he was clearly still a talented person, I mean, that's clear. But he is a role model of what hard work, of effort and hard work. He was not someone who naturally found it easy. I think Rabbi Sachs has an essay where he speaks about the Beethovens and Mozarts of the world. Those for whom brilliance seems to come effortlessly, and those who are brilliant clearly have the potential brilliance, and clearly they've had the potential brilliance, but have to really, really work hard and consistently on a plodding basis to build up to such brilliance. Anyway, so that's the idea of Odessa. We're at 9:43, so rather than starting the next topic, I think, even though this has been slightly shorter than usual, I think we'll pause here. And and then we'll look next week at the philosophical problems with free will. Sorry, yes.
Probably more. There's a book by Herman Hesse called Art from Goldman, trying to bring it in my own words. But he was comparing somebody who was in the monastery, Narcissus, and his Arthur Goldman kind of say do the perfect Madonna or whatever.
Yes.
And in his eyes as an author, they were both stretching for something spiritual. And the question was whether, is somebody in a monastery who's cut off, or somebody in a yeshiva under the same sort of pressures in free choice and bechira as somebody who's outside actually in the real world?
So sorry, thank you for mentioning this, because I can mention this point. Rav Dessa speaks about this also. Again, I'm not going here into the sort of theology of to what degree we're meant to cut ourselves off in the world and not and so on. But Rav Dessa also says, I mean, part of the implication of this is choosing your environment. Given that we have a limited range of free will, we have a responsibility to choose an environment that will create the best circumstances for healthy exercise of free will. And also he makes the point that we can alter the range of free will of others. So one way of thinking of the responsibility of chinuch, of education, whether as teachers or as parents, is and even just the influence we have on others just by mixing in life with people, is to try and shift people's nukudas bechira up as far as possible. So let's say I am lucky enough, because I had incredible and wonderful parents, lucky enough to be born into a world where I have a healthy, reasonably high nukudas bechira. So I can take no credit for that, because this is the world into which I was born, in which my free will was wherever it was on the ladder, 60 on the ladder and so on. And now my responsibility is where I go with that. So who gets the credit if we're talking about din v'cheshbon for where we are born on the Nekudas HaBechira, where our Nekudas HaBechira is set? Perhaps our parents who created the environment for us, or perhaps our great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents who made decisions 150 years ago. The reality is that all of us here in this room are here because of a chain of choices that our ancestors made. And the Nekudas, our responsibility as we in turn try to influence the world, our children, our families, our friends, our students and the like, is to try and lift everyone's Nekudas HaBechira. They themselves may not get particular credit. From an individual's point of view, it may make no difference whether I'm born as a 15 on the ladder or born as a 70 on the ladder. My whole spiritual and moral journey is where I move myself on the ladder. But clearly, it is an advantage if one's able to be higher on the ladder and make better moral decisions. And clearly, it's my responsibility in terms of my own moral decision making to try and create an environment for others in which their Nekudas HaBechira is as high as possible. So yes, we have a responsibility to think about which environment we create for ourselves, and clearly different environments will have different challenges. And we also have a responsibility to try and lift the Nekudas HaBechira of our acquaintances and families and circles of friends. And therefore, their starting point may not be to their credit, but ultimately maybe to the credit of others. The Nekudas of Bechira that each of us find ourselves, as I say, could be based on decisions that were made centuries back by ancestors or by influential teachers. Maybe the Netziv, in the degree to which he has an impact in the Torah world, gets some of the credit for the Nekudas of Bechira of all of us in this room. That's the concept of the ripple effect of the Nekudas of Bechira. Thank you for that.
Yeah. I mean, they really are going to do well because they go from quite low down to quite high up. So
a number of points to that. First of all, yes, in some respects, absolutely. A Baal Tshuva may have advantage over a tzaddik gomor, hence the famous statement, "B'makom shebalid tshuva owned him, afinim tzaddikim gmorim owned him," for sure. Having said that, clearly even a Baal Tshuva is a product of many things beyond their control. There are values and qualities they had which they got from their parents and grandparents and so on, which led to them making that journey, even if in and of itself their parents or grandparents weren't living a halachic life. The truth is, anyone who even knows they're Jewish today and has any sense of Jewish identity is because of 1,000 years of sacrifice. There's no doubt about that. So no one is born pristine into a sort of clean slate in which there's no environmental and ancestral influence on who they are. But yeah, in principle, someone who has the ability to exercise choice but we all balid tshuva in the sense that we all mess up sometimes and we all do teshuva. That's the concept of makom. One of the ideas behind makom shebalid tshuva and mafilim tzaddikim gmorim. Yeah.
Good.
Yes.
Everybody's seen it? No, which is regularly sold out. And it deals with moral and ethical choices where a person is totally influenced. His best friend is a German Jew, and how he'd go from being a moral, upstanding person because the influence of the general surroundings, he gradually falls into within the Third Reich, he becomes that.
The idea of us having moral responsibility, again, when we read the Parshas of Bereshis and we see Avram and Yitzchak and in his own way Yaakov, Vayikra b'Shem Hashem, that is all of us have this. We all have a spiritual and halachic and moral responsibility to try and lift our environment, and that can be done by the way we treat the person at the till in the shop, the way we treat the janitorial staff in our offices or in the shul, how we interact with with our friends and our family. So we all have an obligation for B'Shem Hashem or whatever label one wants to use it. But yeah, I mean the idea that we have a circle and a ripple effect is very integral to this idea. So this is the concept of Nekudas of Bechira. As I said, next week we'll try and look at the philosophical and scientific challenges to the idea. So,